Well, I think for many people it's been a year of surprises. The Holy Father has such a refreshing style, and his desire to be close to people and accessible, and even his accessibility in the way that he expresses himself has made quite an impact on the world. I never remember any other Pope whose daily homily was being followed so assiduously by so many around the globe. It's, before we used to think that the Holy Father's travel and linguistic abilities were, the way that he communicated. But this man communicates without leaving home and without saying anything except in Italian. And it's amazing. In my lifetime, every papacy has been very different from the one that went before. As a child, it was Pius XII, and he was, an aristocrat. He was very ascetic, and he sort of exuded, holiness, and there was a great reverence and awe about his person. But he ate alone. He was very much isolated, and then suddenly comes John the 23rd. It was entirely different, and had a great sense of humor, was always joking, was very close to people, came from the peasant stock, even physically looked so different. And then we had Paul VI, who was in many ways a more modern pope. He began to travel. And then, of course, with John Paul II, the papacy had such a profound influence on the situation in the world, and to change the Iron Curtain, and the Holy Father became present personally to millions and millions of Catholics. So each pope has been very, very different, and obviously this is the first pope from Latin America. His whole pastoral experience is much different from that of European bishops, and he certainly brings a freshness and an excitement to the task. But when you look at the history of the Church, we've had popes who have been so different one from another, and even, as I say, in our modern history, each of them brings their own gifts, and we've been so blessed by the presence of popes who have been very holy men, very wise men, very pastoral men, and whose leadership has been a very positive thing in the life of the Church. And this has not always been the case in the 2,000-year history, but certainly in modern history, we've been very blessed by the popes that we have. Well, there's always a danger of the Church retreating to the sacristy and abdicating our responsibility to do precisely what Jesus tells us to do, to make disciples of all nations, to leave behind the 99 and go in search of the one lost sheep. The Lord in the Gospels is always reaching out to people on the periphery, the lame, the blind, the halt, the tax collector, the prostitute, the foreigner, and the Lord brings them center stage. And so the Holy Father is simply reminding us that this is what the gospel is about. And these people on the periphery in the gospel become the protagonists of Jesus' ministry, and they need to be the object of our love and our pastoral care. Well, the Holy Father's concerned about the careerism in the church, or and he is constantly reminding people that, the Holy Father is not a monarch surrounded by a court, but is a bishop of a community of faith, and that is the perspective that he wants to communicate and for people to embrace. And he certainly, in his decision to live at the Domus Santa Marta, it's not because the apartments in the Apostolic Palace are so luxurious, but he does not want to be isolated. He wants to be part of the community and connected to people. And for him, that culture of encounter is what the church needs to be about. And he's certainly modeling that for us in so many ways. Well, the Roman Curia is not that large an organization, but it is the only organization that the Holy Father has to help him perform his ministry. And obviously, he wants the Curia to be at the service of the universal church. And to do that, there needs to be greater efficiency, transparency, collaboration among the different departments, or dicasteries as they're called, and a greater focus on collegiality, involvement with the bishops throughout the world and the local churches. I think the Holy Father has feels a very strong mandate, because prior to the conclave, it's something that the Cardinal spoke about so much. Of course, it was all taking place in the context of the Vati leaks and all the other problems that had surfaced about the Vatican Bank, and these situations should never exist. And the Holy Father is striving to make a Curia that will be more pastoral and will be at the service of the entire church, and be able to communicate that vision and enthusiasm and the joy of the gospel that he's always preaching about. And he's also concerned about the spiritual welfare of the people in the Curia. He wants them to feel that they're there not just doing a job, but that they're part of a mission, and that mission that comes from Christ. And to be able to carry it out, we need to attend to our own interior life, so that we have a sense of vocation, and that we are being led by God's grace to seek God's will and to embrace it joyfully and generously in our lives. Yes. Well, the focus of the commission will be child's protection. In other words, to make sure that all of the practices of the church are geared towards creating safe environments and having in place practices that will help not just know how to respond in cases of abuse, but how to avoid it. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and particularly when it is something as tragic as child abuse. And the Holy Father is very committed to a policy of no tolerance, and is anxious to have this commission formed to be able to work with the bishops' conferences, who have been asked to develop clear guidelines and policies around this whole area of child protection. And we're very edified by how many people have already volunteered to be a part of this. And Well, I think it's very, very important. There were two commissions working very hard. The former commission of Benedict XVI, and now that was looking at the bank, and now the commission that the Holy Father has had looking at the overall financial picture of the Vatican. It is a question of stewardship, of trying to make sure that the Church's resources that are limited are used for the mission of the Church, for the works of mercy, the care for the poor, for works of evangelization. We want to avoid any waste, and to make sure that there is great transparency so that people have trust that when they make a donation to the Church that it will be used for the purposes for which the money has been entrusted to the Church. And Cardinal Pell is an extraordinary individual. He's a man of great energy and vision and determination, and he has been involved in many of these issues in the Holy See for a long time, so he has an understanding of the challenges, and it was very generous of him to be willing to sacrifice his own ministry in the Archdiocese of Sydney to come to Rome and dedicate himself to this very important work. I like the phrase that someone said that he is not changing the lyrics, but only the melody. Sometimes the Church's message was perhaps too harshly presented to people and out of context. He is trying to show us the whole context of the demands of discipleship. But the whole context is in the context of God's love and mercy and desire to accompany us and to forgive us when we fall and to help us to overcome our weaknesses and to have a sense of connectedness to the Lord and with one another. Well, obviously, when it comes to the Church's teaching on the permanence of marriage, there's no way to change that. Now, obviously, the Holy Father and many people are looking, would love to see a possibility for people to reconnect with the sacraments. Many of the cardinals were insistent that we must look for better ways to do the annulments in a way that can be done with greater expedition. And but this is certainly something that will be talked about and discussed at the upcoming synods. But regardless of whatever happens, the Church's teaching on the permanence of marriage is not something that can ever be changed. Well, you know, the Church's teachings, particularly where there is, you know, when they are demanding on people's lives, often are rejected out of hand. And I think, as I said before, the Holy Father is trying to give us the context in which we live those teachings. And that context is one of, you know, living in God's love and His mercy, and being instruments of mercy in the world, helping people to find the strength to live a life of discipleship that cannot be lived alone, but in community, the Holy Father talks about the art of accompaniment and the culture of encounter. And in our culture, which is so individualistic, the demands of the gospel, of course, become impossible. But when a person becomes truly part of a community of faith and begins to experience the joy of the gospel that the Holy Father is always speaking about, and experiences God's love in their life, then what before seemed impossible and unreasonable suddenly become feasible and begin to make sense. Well, I hope so. The Holy Father talked about the globalization of indifference, and we cannot be indifferent to human suffering, and we cannot pretend that people are not trying to get into Europe and into the United States because they're trying to escape some horrific economic and political situations to be able to have a better life for their children. I remember when I was bishop in Florida, there were boats arriving from these, really rafts and small boats arriving from Cuba and Haiti to Florida. And after the Red Mass, we were having breakfast with the governor, was Jeb Bush at the time, and I said to him, Mr. Bush, if the O'Malleys and the Bushes were in Haiti now, they'd be building a boat. I think so. The other thing is, in the States, as I always say, Europe would love to have our problems. Our immigrants, their children will be Americans. And despite the xenophobia and some of the problems we have, we are a nation of immigrants, and people do assimilate into this country, and they have brought such energy and such a work ethic and family values and other wonderful things that have redounded to the strength and the glory of this country that, to pretend that somehow immigration is bad for us is nonsense. I see it as, particularly in the United States, as moving away from being a cultural Catholicism, a tribal Catholicism, where if you were Italian or Polish or Irish, automatically you received all the sacraments and went to church and so forth. And now it's becoming much more intentional, much more depending on the individual. And this will mean a new kind of evangelization that's going to be much more focused on meeting each individual and personally inviting them and mentoring them in a life of faith. That we can no longer depend on the cultural background to be enough. Where that's there as a starting point, that's wonderful, but the personal conversion to the Lord and experience of His love and grace in our lives and a sense of a community is all very important. And obviously, a priest cannot do this on his own. The new evangelization is going to depend very much on an army of lay people feeling responsible for their church and to be messengers of the good news to their families, to their neighbors, and to their community at large. It's hard to forecast, but obviously the enthusiasm that the Holy Father's simplicity and joy and accessibility has created, not just in our own Catholic community, but in the larger society, has something that I think has been helpful to the world. Even the situation in Syria, where the Holy Father called for prayer, and and a solution was found. I mean, it was a very moving thing to, and when we're reminded that when we all come together in faith and hope and put our trust in the Lord and invoke His guidance and blessing on our endeavors, that wonderful things can happen.